Outline that?
Well, I think that definitely is the reason Prop 203 came about, is because we are not seeing Hispanic students progressing as they should be after 30 years of a failed program. Also, going back a little bit to the statistics that supposedly now have come about in the last 3 years, which I kind of think is a little ironic. After 30 years, only 3 years ago, they decided to compile data. Number one, the reading scores still for limited English proficient students are 23% below the native speaker of English. To me, I think that's a catastrophe. Also, what you need to understand is that within the bilingual education program, coordinators themselves, bilingual consultants and coordinators, exempt students from the Stanford 9 test. So as I looked at the data that was put together by the State Department of Education, of the 103,000 students that were identified LEP, 49% only took the Stanford 9. That means 51% of these LEP students were exempt or were given La Aprenda, which is a Spanish version of a test, and then there was like 39,000 students that they can't even report data on. I think that in itself can't even talk about how bad statistics are for the bilingual education proponents. Also, the Arizona State Department has even come about with some recommendations saying there needs to be some standardization. There were too many exemptions, specific criteria as to why schools are giving exemption to these students. We need to look into that. So what I'm saying is that let's standardize the test for all kids. Let's make all of the students, as in California, they were in an English immersion class. Let's find out who really is learning to speak English, if that is the true intent of the bilingual education law, that is for students to learn and master English.
She obviously has some substantial statistics to prove that academically the kids aren't doing well in these programs.
Well, actually, she's completely ignored what Senator Joe D. Lopez has just told us. Arizona doesn't have the problem California had, where they didn't have statistics. We test our students every year by law, even the Ames test. No one's excluded. Every student has to take the test. And in the state of Arizona, it is very clear. Students in bilingual education outperform LEP students in regular English immersion programs.
Okay, this is very confusing.
Well, first of all, they are giving a Spanish version of not the Stanford 9. No,
the
in
scores
Spanish.
I'm talking about are the scores
in English. But how many of those kids were exempt? How many of those kids in bilingual programs who they did not want to show the scores were exempt?
When you see the percentage of regular kids in English classes that missed taking the regular test, and you compare it to the percentage of kids, LEP students that missed taking the test, they're equivalent.
Well, I wonder why the State Department of Education didn't put that forward, because I sure don't see it, and I've read that.
It's on their website.
I've read the website, and there really is no distinction of those kids in bilingual programs.
It's on the website, and I have a copy in my office. I can give you a copy of that.
All right, that'd be fine.
Something that can further skew the issue is something that has been happening in my high school with my students. This is just my high school and just my students. Over the last 2 years, I've had reports, papers sent to me about certain bilingual education students who have been classified bilingual education since they started the school in TUSD. This has been about 10 or 12 over the last 2.5 years. These kids, when I approach them about reclassifying them, which is what this form is asking me to do, if they should speak English well enough to be reclassified, I approach the students, they say, I didn't even know I was in bilingual education. I call their parents didn't even know they were in bilingual education. Suddenly I'm getting these forms to reclassify them as not bilingual education students. Can they speak? Well, they've always spoken English. They've never spoken Spanish. This is a common occurrence.
Hector's a little confused. It's not bilingual education.
Oh, it is.
It's a student that's designated as a student who's developing proficiency in English. It does not mean that student was in bilingual education. That's one of the problems, Hector. The student may have been in an ESL program, all English, all his life.
Exactly, and you're still getting money for the fact that he was reported bilingual education.
Are you a little confused, Hector?
I am not confused at all.
Just a little.
In fact, when we have spoken to the statistician for the Arizona Department of Education, she in fact has concurred with us that these statistics should be taken with a grain of salt, because asking bilingual agenda about the state of bilingual education is, again, as I said, asking a shark about how the water is, you know. They say everything's fine.
But asking an English teacher is a whole different matter.
It's calling you guys sharks.
And in fact, the spokesperson from the Arizona Ed Department, I quoted that I asked don't you think that these findings suggest that in bilingual education programs that more of these schools exempted more students in bilingual education than in our English as a second language programs? And the spokesperson responded for the Arizona the department said that that could have been the case, but only those school districts will know for sure, because that's where they get their data.
Dolores, we can spend a lifetime discussing. We can spend a lifetime discussing anecdotal evidence. The fact of the matter is that we now have a history, a record of bilingual education, and we have a history in California of the results of English immersion. And by whatever standards you want to compare. Now look, 2 years ago, English for the children were suggesting that how dismal bilingual education was, because only 2.5% of our students were transitioning out of bilingual education. Well, that figure is false, and we never pretended that our students were going to gain English competency in 1 year. After they're reclassified after 1 year, that figure jumps up to 11. But in California, the reclassification rates, which these people were criticizing us for, are a lot less than they are in this state for bilingual education students. So why should we substitute a program which now, after 3 years, we can compare it, and it doesn't compare favorably with whatever we have here in bilingual education?
Hector, I need for you to address the issue of the future of these kids. How is the bilingual program affecting their futures economically?
The last summer, the AP released a study, the results of a study that said that over the last 40 years, the discrepancy in achievement between the Anglo students and Mexican-American students had remained exactly the same. When you talk about certain school districts, you look at the test scores of all these bilingual education schools all over Arizona, you find that they're scoring at the very bottom of the pile. In fact,
is this going to affect them later in life?
Oh, positively. I mean, when these kids, and again, we heard this story dozens and dozens of times when we've spoken with parents, their kids are not learning English, and their kids tend to drop out in the 10th or 11th grade. They are just biding their time until they turn 16 years of age, and they begin to drop out. The dropout rate of the Mexican-American student in Arizona is twice that of the Anglo student.
Do we want to keep a program that's continuing to possibly hurt these kids?
We certainly want to keep a program that is helping the vast majority of Latino students. Now, let me say that if we want to put blame, only about 5% of the students that are labeled as limited English students are in any classes that are gaining any tremendous use of Spanish to teach them English. So if we're going to lay blame, we ought to blame it on the fact that we don't have enough bilingual education programs where
so part of the problem
home language is being used to teach English.
Okay, so
now,
part of the problem is the programs, the bilingual programs.
Shortage of teachers is the problem.
Now let me,
Native
let me say
language
additionally,
instruction is the problem.
Let me say additionally that every day, every school and every district in this state uses bilingual education for the majority of students. When we teach French or English or German, what do? We use bilingual education. We use the home language, English, in order to gain competence in the language that we're teaching. It's okay for the majority, but it's not okay for our kids.
Quickly, you were a product of an immersion program.
Exactly. We immigrated to America, my family did, when I was 9 years of age. My brothers, my friends, my relatives, we ended up at Lincoln Elementary School in Nogales, Arizona. We had Mrs. Hildreth, Mrs. Hayden, Mrs. Fox, Mrs. Wolf, Mrs. Ledford. None of them spoke any Spanish whatever. Okay, and none of them spoke any English. None of them spoke any Spanish. None of us spoke any English when we came. Within weeks, we were already speaking.
Look at Hector today.
I too. I am a product of immersion, just like Hector.
And is Mr. Joe Lopez.
And I did just fine. And I can point to myself and say, there's proof that immersion works, and immersion does work. I'll be the first to admit that. However, for whom does immersion work? And traditionally, it has worked for about 5% of our kids. And the other kids failed through immersion. That's the problem.
We're all
We're running out
examples
of
of
time.
immersion.
Quickly, why should people vote yes on Proposition 203 and ban bilingual education?
There is only one way that students can go by voting Proposition 203, and that's up. Mexican-American students will finally learn the English they need to know to graduate in record numbers from high school. instead of dropping out in record numbers from high school.
We ought to defeat Proposition 203 because bilingual education worked. The data suggests that it does. The other thing is that this initiative takes away local control from the parents, from the teachers, from local school districts in determining the educational future of their children. And thirdly, and just as important to me, is that it neutralizes the ability of Native Americans to continue to preserve their language.
Okay, and that vote is November 7th. Thank you all for being here and sharing your points of view on this issue. Thank you for joining us today on the Phoenix File. I'm Dolores Trafiano. We'll see you again next week.